Good afternoon and welcome, everyone. My name is Brittany Galati. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Housing Project Coordinator with the National Alliance to End Sexual Violence. I'd like to welcome everyone to today's webinar all about HUD, an overview of HUD with an emphasis on supporting survivors of sexual assault. Before we start, I'd like to go over a few logistics. We do have Spanish interpretation today. To select your preferred language, please go to the globe icon on your toolbar and select your preferred language. We also have ASL interpretation available. The ASL interpreter will be highlighted throughout today's webinar on the main screen. Additionally, today's webinar features live closed captioning. To engage, please click on the CC button on your toolbar. At this time, we invite you to introduce yourself in the chat. Feel free to share your name, pronouns, organization, state, whatever you'd like. We do ask that today you post all questions in the Q&A box. Questions in the box may be answered in real time or held until later in today's presentation. If at any point you find yourself needing technical assistance, please message myself or Camille by changing the to recipient in the chat box to either all panelist hosts or directly to myself. I'd like to let folks know that today's webinar is being recorded. Once finalized, a link to the recording will be shared. A copy of the slide deck will be made available for all attendees in a follow-up email. And with that, I would like to pass it to Allison.
Thank you so much, Brittany. I am Allison Kolar. I am a policy advisor with the Office on Gender-Based Violence in the Office of the Secretary at HUD. And we're very excited to be here with you all and have this presentation on HUD, on our office, as well as going through the Violence Against Women Act and how the housing provisions apply to our housing programs. I also want to introduce Yvette Richardson, who is a policy advisor detailee. Yvette, are you on?
Hi, yes, I'm here. Hello, everyone. I'm Yvette Richardson, a policy advisor detailee, as Allison said, here temporarily on detail with the Office of Gender-Based Violence. I am coming from HUD's Office of Housing Counseling, and I'm very happy to be here with everyone today.
Thank you so much. I also want to let you know, we'll talk a little bit when we talk about the Office on Gender-Based Violence, but in the audience, we also have Lavon Pepe, who is our senior advisor. She just started this week, so she is joining us as well. I think she's going to jump in the chat and just say hi. She won't be speaking, but she is here as well. With that, we're going to get started. We definitely have planned some time for questioning, so we're going to try to make sure we still maintain that time at the end of this presentation. So if you do have any questions, we can take some time to answer those. And if you can go to the next slide for me.
Okay, so before we begin, I first would like to acknowledge that this webinar is being sponsored by the Department of Justice, Office of Violence Against Women, and the content, opinions, and recommendations expressed here today do not necessarily reflect the views of OVW. And so for today, you're going to receive an overview of HUD's Office on Gender-Based Violence, which is still fairly new, but we're happy to share some insight on that. We'll also provide a very brief history of the Violence Against Women Act, VAWA, you'll hear us refer to VAWA throughout the rest of this webinar, and also the history of housing rights and protections for survivors of gender-based violence and where they stand today. And then we'll also provide a short overview of key HUD offices and resources that you might find important and relevant. We do understand that HUD is a rather large and complex entity. And if I'm being honest, I'm still discovering offices that we have here. So next slide.
Okay, so we are going to talk about HUD, we're going to talk about VAWA, but we're going to start with HUD's Office on Gender-Based Violence. So that's where I am stationed. That's where Yvette is detailed at. And the very exciting part of this office is that it is a brand new office in HUD. And so every time we do a presentation or we are talking to folks, we want to share our office for many, many different reasons, but also just that like we are available for your questions, for your contacts. We are here for you, for our housing providers, for people in our housing programs, or for people that are working with survivors, working on housing barriers, or just trying to get housing and have questions about the process and the protections for survivors. Our office is here for you all. And so the Office on Gender-Based Violence came about as part of the VAWA 2022 reauthorization. We are going to talk a little bit about the history of VAWA and give you some context. It's also in the slides, which before anyone asks, we will be providing them. The recording will also be available. So all of this will be available for you to review in the future as well. And so with the reauthorization of 2022, actually in the statute was a requirement for HUD to create an office that is specifically in charge of implementing VAWA and the VAWA housing provisions. So what our office is in charge of is kind of that cross-cutting. As we know, HUD has many program offices. We're going to talk about many of them today at a high level because they are very complicated and nuanced. But our office cross-cuts across all of that to try to make sure that we are consistently implementing VAWA and that across all our programs, the policies, the programs are incorporating the protections for survivors. In addition, we talk about gender-based violence. We talk about the intersection of gender-based violence and housing and safe housing. We talk about economic stability for survivors kind of across the board. And so what that means for our office is we do many things. We do policy on gender-based violence and housing issues. We implement VAWA across HUD and with all their agencies. And then we also are the lead office for HUD's VAWA training and technical assistance. So some of you may know that HUD received about $10 million in training and technical assistance to work with people implementing the housing provisions under VAWA. And our office is the lead for that. And we'll talk a little bit about what that looks like and what we're working on. Next slide, please.
Okay, so part of that training and technical assistance is having all of this centrally located and easily accessible. So there's now a website on hud.gov/VAWA. It's a pretty expansive clearinghouse on VAWA resources available to the public. It was crafted kind of as a one-stop shop for everyone to use to include survivors. So there are national and local resources for survivors, how to file a VAWA complaint with the FHEO, the Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity. This is where all of our legal authorities will be posted, to include the VAWA statute, the regulations, the notices, the guidance. And as more guidance comes out, this is where it will be posted. It also has VAWA forms in multiple languages. So we'll talk about those VAWA forms later, but this is where you'll be able to locate those. And we do have multiple languages. There's VAWA cases that you can review. And this is also where all of our training resides. This is where it lives. So to include this one, so when this one is available to us to share, this is where we'll post it. Next slide.
As additional resources come out of HUD, we want to talk a little bit about HUD's VAWA training and technical assistance. So the housing provisions, as we'll discuss, have been available to survivors for many years. And also we know that people still need access to information to understand these provisions, to properly implement these provisions. And also many of the housing provisions require an understanding of the experience that survivors are going through, how they may show up to their housing providers, what to be thoughtful of, how to work with survivors in a way that is trauma informed, that is survivor centered. And so our office has really been developing a number of resources using our training and technical assistance to do that. And so we wanted to highlight that here because we also know that these trainings and other resources, while potentially for a housing provider, for people who are providing housing or our housing programs, it can also be really helpful for survivors. It can be helpful for people working with survivors, kind of across the board, particularly as we start to develop some of our foundational series, which I'll talk about. So some of what's coming out of HUD through our training and technical assistance, or our TA, is number one, trainings. So we've been starting to do a lot of trainings. We've been doing trainings across different program offices. So each program office has VAWA responsibilities, but then they also have program specific requirements. So working with housing programs to make sure that they understand their responsibilities and they're implementing them and operationalizing them within their own programs. In addition, we are creating what we're calling our foundational series, or our 101 series, or our toolkit on VAWA. So that's going to include just some foundations on gender-based violence, including the dynamics of sexual assault, domestic violence, human trafficking, also dating violence and stalking. So those are the types of violence that fall under VAWA. In addition, resources on culturally responsiveness, trauma and trauma-informed practice, vicarious trauma and self-care, and then also how housing providers can think through partnerships with victim service providers. So we know that housing providers may not be able to provide everything that survivors need as they're experiencing different, forms of VAWA violence and abuse, but there are other resources locally, other people they can partner with, and kind of what does that look like. In addition to that series, we are also working on a series that covers kind of all the housing protections under VAWA. So we're going to talk about these broadly in a couple slides, but we will also be having resources available that talk through the federal, state, and local housing protections, the history of VAWA, and then deeper dives into some of these larger VAWA provisions, housing provisions, or just areas in which people have a lot of questions and concerns around. We're going to have some deeper training materials. So that's kind of our training series. And then we're also in line with those and kind of in conjunction with those, going to have fact sheets, resources, things that can be provided in one page that are very plain language and accessible to kind of anyone who's using it. We also have office hours and on-call TA. So we meet consistently with housing providers and with different people working with survivors around our, questions on VAWA, questions on how to implement VAWA, and then also just understanding gender-based violence and the needs of survivors. Next slide.
So what is gender-based violence? So what are we talking about when we say gender-based violence? I'm going to touch on this just a little bit because for the sake of time, because this can all be trainings all on their own, right? And we do have trainings on these topics on our website, and specifically the language, the definitions are also on that website I was referring to earlier. But what are we talking about when we say gender-based violence? We're talking about domestic violence, sexual assault, dating violence, stalking, and human trafficking. And while human trafficking isn't specifically listed in VAWA, we include it in our discussion of gender-based violence because it's very nuanced, right? And I want to point out that it's very important to note that survivors are not monolithic. They can experience one or all types of this violence at any given time. We don't want to put survivors in any one category. So domestic violence is, as you may know, is a pattern of abusive behaviors used to gain and maintain power and control. This is typically an intimate partner, romantic partner, as well as dating violence. This is typically a romantic partner. But I want to make the note and the difference between stalking and sexual assault. This does not have to be an intimate partner, romantic partner. This can show up as a landlord, a friend, a neighbor, a coworker. So I think that's just kind of important to note that. Let's see.
And if I could add on that as well, Yvette, thank you so much. That is primarily the definition when we talk about domestic violence and dating violence under VAWA, but we have seen an expansion of that to move just outside of intimate partner violence as well, particularly on like state and local levels. So depending on what survivors you are working with are experiencing, I always recommend HUD.gov/VAWA has our VAWA definitions for federal programs, and we'll talk about what those are. But your state and local programs for all of these types of violence may have broader protections as well, both in affordable housing units as well as potentially market rate units or units without federally assisted funds. So something to always consider.
Right. Yes. Good point. And then, and while we know that women and girls are disproportionately affected by gender-based violence, we also want to highlight that gender-based violence encompasses all genders, regardless of how someone identifies. So this affects men and boys, the LGBTQIA plus community, gender nonconforming, and transgender individuals. Anything else to add, Allison, on that? I know this is one slide with a lot of information.
Yes. And we have a lot of information on our site about this, and happy to answer additional questions. But I know many people on this call particularly really understand gender-based violence and have been working with survivors and know what that looks like. I think what's helpful to understand as well when HUD is talking to housing providers specifically who are very knowledgeable about housing and the dynamics of housing and the requirements of affordable housing, and maybe less knowledgeable on the nuances of gender-based violence, is the statute and the regulations really work to make sure that it is not the housing provider that needs to put someone in a specific bucket. So it is not as if they need to identify that someone is specifically experiencing domestic violence or specifically experiencing sexual assault. There are broad protections for any survivor experiencing any of these things. And we can talk about a little bit about the protections, and we will, but a survivor just needs to say, I qualify under VAWA when they're looking to access these housing protections. And they don't need to, share their whole story or really identify with one of these types of violence, because that can be it can be re-traumatizing. It also doesn't really necessarily impact the protections that they are afforded, right? They are just afforded them as a survivor of what we generally call VAWA violence and abuse. But we understand when we're working with survivors that there may be different experiences or different things that are challenging or hard or barriers, depending on the type of violence they're experiencing.
Okay, next slide. So why is it important to talk about gender-based violence while talking about homelessness and housing instability? So domestic violence is a leading cause of homelessness for women and children. 42% of homeless youth have experienced child sexual abuse. 25% of homeless adults have experienced child sexual abuse. 1 in 5 runaway and homeless youth are victim of human trafficking, inclusive of sex and labor trafficking. And 80% of homeless women and with children have experienced domestic violence. So it's important to note that primarily homeless youth identify as LGBTQIA, and women of color, specifically Black women and girls, are disproportionately impacted by gender-based violence. This is why we want to reiterate that survivors are not monolithic. They experience gender-based violence at the intersection of race, gender, and many more.
Next slide. Okay, so we lay out those statistics because while they are very challenging to see, right? They help us understand why these housing protections under VAWA, which initially, as we'll talk when we get to the history, did not include housing protections, why they're so important. Because safe and stable housing can be a huge protective aspect for survivors. And so we're going to talk a little bit about what those protections are, where they apply, and particularly think through the protections and how they may be specifically important for survivors of sexual assault. But generally, VAWA provides housing protections for survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, dating violence, and stalking, with the caveat that, often because people experiencing human trafficking will fall into one of those categories. We also talk about human trafficking under VAWA as well. And these protections, generally, there are some smaller, not smaller, but a few of them that apply to non-federally assisted housing in rare cases, but generally they apply to people applying for or living in federally assisted housing, which I think is very important when we're working with survivors who often they are just looking for assistance and they find information about VAWA. And then many times it will apply if they're in kind of like an affordable or assisted units. But if they're in a market rate unit or another unit, these same protections may not apply. But again, there may be state or local protections that expand out past VAWA that would apply for those market rate units.
Okay. And then also, even though this is called the Violence Against Women Act, VAWA applies to all survivors, regardless of their sex, gender identity, sexual orientation, as I mentioned before. But also the disability and age are also protected by VAWA. And that also includes other fair housing requirements. So again, this is why it's important to highlight how survivors have intersecting identities.
Great. Next slide, please. Okay, so here are our VAWA covered housing programs. So obviously, Yvette and I, we are from HUD. So, and HUD, as the housing agency, has a majority of the covered housing programs. So these are the programs where the VAWA protections within federally assisted programs apply. We call them covered housing programs, or if you're talking about the person providing that housing, it's the covered housing provider. So here is a list. I think this is always helpful because often, we hear survivors say, well, I know I'm with a HUD program, or I know that I have an affordable unit, or things like that. But there is actually a number of programs within HUD. And kind of when we talk about navigating through HUD, it will be definitely important, especially if you reach out to our office or are looking for assistance, to identify which of these programs a person is in, because that will help figure out which office or which program office or which person to connect that survivor to make sure that we can really address that issue. But many different types of housing programs under HUD. Additionally, I think it's important to note that there are housing programs not covered by HUD that also has a VAWA protection. So one of the ones that I always think about is the low income housing tax credit. So that's actually run by Treasury, a huge housing program. There are many low income housing tax credit units, and they also have VAWA protections, but it may not be something that someone thinks about as often as potentially a HUD program. So when you're working with survivors who come in from many different programs or areas, this can be a helpful tool to look at and try to figure out which program they're in and whether VAWA would apply. And then again, if they are not in one of these covered programs, looking at more a state and local level to see what other protections may be available. Next slide, please. Okay, so with that in mind, we're going to talk broadly through, there's many things under VAWA, particularly it has been reauthorized a number of times and it continues to grow, but we're going to kind of talk about some of the broad protections under VAWA. So one of the main ones is that survivors who are in federally assisted or programs or covered housing programs cannot be denied admission, assistance, threatened with eviction, or have their assistance terminated because of the violence committed against them or because of the trauma that they are experiencing. So I think that's very important to note. And that is often where we see people have questions. And so I think it's helpful to talk to this group because, you know, when we are working with housing providers, we have seen an increase in an understanding of how that relates to domestic violence, right? Where if there is physical damage to a unit, which is a violation of their lease, or some sort of altercation, something like that, people are starting to connect that that cannot be a reason to terminate someone's assistance because, you know, the harm doer cause damage to the unit within a domestic violence situation. But this is true for all of the types of violence, right? So we have also worked with individuals who are experiencing sexual assault, and that may be less outwardly obvious to individuals, but there may be other ways in which that is showing up. They may not be in their unit anymore. They may not be coming to certain meetings with their housing provider due to the trauma or whatever has happened. Those situations, those things that are kind of maybe tangentially related to some people, but are very, very connected to the survivor, connected to the trauma that they've experienced, connected to how that is allowing them to interact with their housing provider or with their housing program, those can also not be used to evict someone or to deny someone assistance.
Okay. And furthermore, so anyone who is receiving assistance has the right to receive notice of VAWA housing rights when they're admitted, when they're denied admission or assistance, and when they're receiving an eviction notice. So this is anyone. This is important because when someone's applying for assistance, you won't know if they may be experiencing violence. And oftentimes people just don't know their rights. They may not be aware of all the different various types of violence that they qualify for. As we all know, domestic violence is pretty high up there. A lot of people know what domestic violence is, but a lot of people aren't aware that they have rights as a sexual assault survivor, dating violence and stalking, etc. In addition, when survivors do want to exercise their rights, they can choose to self-certify. So they can use this self-certification form. One thing to point out when completing this form is they don't have to identify as one type of survivor. They can identify that they are just experiencing domestic gender-based violence. And this is just one way of certification. A survivor can submit a police report or text messages or phone calls, but it's important to remember that this form is here and this can be used in lieu of that, and it is the survivor that makes that decision.
Yes, yes. And all of these are also available on hud.gov/VAWA. So the notice of occupancy for housing rights, and then also the self-certification form. Both of those are available. We also anticipate they will be updated soon. So survivors can use that. They can also provide, as Yvette highlighted, any other information. And it is the survivor's choice what they provide to their housing provider. So if they do have an order of protection, or if they do have a police report and they want to provide that instead, they are welcome to, but they do not have to. And this self-certification form really just says, like, I certify. It has the list of the types of violence on there, what the definitions under VAWA are, and then a survivor can certify and say, yes, I qualify under these definitions, and so they don't have to highlight a particular type of violence. Additionally, sorry, not yet. Additionally, there can be a request to remove a harm doer or perpetrator from a lease or housing unit where applicable. This is something that a survivor can request of their housing provider depending on safety and what makes sense to them. But it is also an option, particularly if a survivor comes to you when they are being evicted, and potentially it is, the harm doer or the perpetrator, right? We see that where something will happen in the unit, something will happen on the property, and the survivor will also be evicted. And based on our protection in number 1, they cannot be evicted. They cannot have their assistance terminated because they're not at fault, right? They are experiencing violence from someone else. It's not their fault. And so therefore they need to keep their housing. So then an option available to housing providers instead is to potentially remove the perpetrator from the lease or from the housing unit. So that is always an option. Obviously there's safety considerations depending on if that person is still living there and what's happening. But something helpful to note.
And also what's important to note is that survivors who are receiving certain assistance, like the housing choice voucher or tenant-based rental assistance, they are able to continue their assistance if they decide to move. So, for example, if someone's living in like a multifamily unit, they can move to a fair market private unit, and it is the housing provider that can help navigate this process. So it moves with them. Go ahead.
Yes. And just to note, not the only time, but one of the times in which protections under VAWA may apply to, a market rate or a private owned unit would be if there's a housing choice voucher. So if someone has a housing choice voucher, but they're in, a private unit, these protections still apply because they're receiving a subsidy. So next slide, please.
Okay, so the survivor gets to decide whether or not they want to stay in their current unit, even if there's criminal activity that is directly related to the trauma. There are many reasons why a survivor may want to stay in their unit. It is not for us to investigate or decide that. But the housing provider can help with that as well. They can help by changing the locks, barring someone from the property. If the survivor says that they feel safe in this unit and they want to continue living there, then that is something that the housing provider can work with to help make that survivor continue to feel comfortable there.
Absolutely. Additionally, there is the ability for survivors to request an emergency. Oh, that's okay. There is an ability for survivors to request an emergency transfer to another unit. So the requirement for this is essentially if a survivor feels that they are at risk of imminent harm by staying in their current unit, they qualify for an emergency transfer. And so that means that they can move to another program, they can move to the same program but another unit. And again, with many of the things under VAWA, it is at the discretion of the survivor as to what is defined as a safe unit. So we have often seen sometimes in programs, they will have to move like across the city or even out of a city in order to be in a safe location. But for other people, it could be right that it's just the unit itself is causing further harm. And so maybe a move to somewhere else in the building would help resolve that. It is the discretion of the survivor what makes sense for them based on also what's available, right? And so something to also note here under the imminent harm, just to clarify, because we often get questions, there is another qualifying aspect of emergency transfers, which is if there was an incident of sexual assault in the unit 90 days prior, they can request an emergency transfer as well. I often see confusion for sexual assault survivors where people will say, well, there wasn't an incident of sexual assault 90 days ago, but they're saying they were sexually assaulted and so they don't qualify. That is not true, right? It is an or statement. So either a incident of sexual assault occurred in the unit 90 days ago, or the survivor believes that they will experience imminent harm by remaining in their unit. And as we understand, right, imminent harm can look like many different things. It can be physical violence, but for sexual assault survivors, I think this imminent harm is really important because it also can be continued trauma or psychological or emotional harm from remaining in a unit. So I have worked with survivors of sexual assault where the assault happened in their unit. It is not likely that another assault will happen based on what they've shared with me, but just being in the unit is causing them continued harm, and they would still qualify for an emergency transfer under that. And again, they don't have to identify a specific type of violence that they're associating when they're requesting an emergency transfer. They can just self-certify or provide documentation, whatever they like, and then request that emergency transfer with their housing provider.
And so VAWA also protects survivors' confidentiality related to the violence and their status as a survivor. It's also important for housing providers to think about this because, as you stated earlier, landlords can be perpetrators, right? So navigating that with care is very important. It can also be very harmful to their safety. It can break the trust you may have already built with that survivor. And just want to also highlight while I'm talking about this, it's also very important to think about what you are asking survivors, what is absolutely needed and what is absolutely necessary to document because their confidentiality is protected.
Yes, thank you so much. And this is true as well when you are potentially helping a survivor navigate the housing programs. Housing providers need to keep these things strictly confidential, including the fact that they are a survivor at all, as well as if they're doing an emergency transfer, information about their location. That information, it should be separate from other tenant files, just depending on the makeup of the family or the household, right? We never know what's happening and what's going on. And again, this is why we have the self-certification form, and it's up to the discretion of the survivors. They can provide as little or as much information as they want to their housing provider when requesting these protections. And that's true. I saw a question in the chat. That's true if they're requesting any of these protections, including an emergency transfer. We're going to move on, but that's kind of the broad protections. There's other protections as well, but that is the ones that we've seen survivors interact with the most and the most consistently. So if people have additional questions, please let us know.
Yeah. And I know we're getting close to time, and this is another area where this could be a whole nother training on itself, but we do want to just give like a brief history of where the background of survivors' rights and protections. So it really grew out of like several movements from the 60s and 70s, such as the labor movement, the civil rights, the anti-war movement, and the women's rights movement. And they really wanted to stop that privatization of abuse. So any like what happens behind closed doors, like, and really move towards like legal and systemic policy change, right? And then we saw in like the 80s and 90s, a lot of those grassroots organizations were creating safe houses and shelters. And this is what really laid the foundation and the groundwork for the Violence Against Women Act. Next slide. So it wasn't until 1994 that the Violence Against Women Act was enacted. So I think what is really important to note here is that it's an ever-evolving piece of legislation. Right? It's been reauthorized several times, and it will continue to be reauthorized. And so in 2005, this is the first time we're seeing the VAWA housing title. So this is the first time housing protections were mandated for survivors and statutory protections for domestic violence, dating violence, and stalking. And while we know in the field, and those of us working direct services, we also included sexual assault, it wasn't until, next slide, 2013 that those protections were officially like in the language, so those protections were extended to sexual assault survivors. And it also added that affiliated individual definition, which included other members of the household. I know that was also kind of hard to navigate. And then just additional federal programs were covered. So essentially all of HUD's rental assistance programs were covered at this point, which that was really quick, right? So that brings us to 2022, which is what we, I think, want to talk about a little bit more and focus on, give some space for that. But from that, I just want to reiterate that all of the protections from 2013 remain, and they're just expanded. These protections were expanded. So this included the definition of economic and technology abuse. It prohibited retaliation. It provided a space for survivors to file a complaint with HUD and the Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity. And I think Allison's going to talk about that more in the next slide. So I know that's really fast, and I apologize, but I think I just wanted to give you a brief overview.
Thank you so much. And I think we've definitely seen, we're so happy that VAWA is something that gets reauthorized because it means it can continue to grow with the ways in which we're seeing violence show up and the experience of survivors. And so our office also has the opportunity to continue to think through that and talk and share with what does that mean as we create regulations and create guidance for our housing providers with a lens towards being survivor-centered and trauma-informed. So I think about, technology abuse and how that has been connected to sexual abuse and things like that. And so we continue to have those conversations and try to expand these definitions to make sure that we're capturing, as Yvette shared earlier, all of the different experiences of survivors. So what does VAWA 2022 and these housing provisions mean for HUD? It means we have a lot of implementing to do. We're still implementing. So we are working on our HUD VAWA 2022 regulations. They have not been updated yet, but we have provided some interim guidance. So that was published in 2023 for each program office as well. So if there's specific program offices or programs that a survivor is in, you may be able to look at those and see what guidance we already have. We have noted that some of the VAWA 2022 changes can be self-implementing. So for example, the updates to the definition or technology abuse or economic abuse, we can start using those. Housing providers can start using those as, how someone could qualify under VAWA even before our regulations come out. So we have some information about that. We're also updating our VAWA forms. So those are the notice of occupancy rights, like what are the VAWA rights that an individual has. Those are our self-certification form and our emergency transfer request form. And then also our emergency transfer model document that housing providers use to outline what are their actual policies and procedures for implementing emergency transfer. So we anticipate that those will be updated, and they actually haven't been updated with the 2013 new regulations. So we're updating those, and then we'll update them again with our 2022 regulations as well. We also, FHEO has issued an enforcement notice. So they've really expanded their enforcement of violations under VAWA. And so survivors can file complaints specifically because their VAWA rights have been violated, because they were denied or not given assistance due to something related to the violence that they're experiencing, not given an emergency transfer, those things. They can now go on to the FHEO site and file a formal complaint. And we'll have some information about that as well. And then more training and technical assistance, which we've already tried. Next slide, please. Another aspect of the VAWA 2022 that we are implementing, but we are very excited about, is the homelessness definition. So there are a series of programs, covered housing programs, that are covered by McKinney-Vento, which is actually another law or statute. And that talks about a number of categories of homeless. And so those are programs really targeted at homelessness and homelessness prevention. And category 4 is this intersection where we know often that survivors, even though they may have housing, be living in an affordable housing, or even any type of housing, if they are fleeing or attempting to flee or experiencing unsafe conditions in their current housing units, in some ways they really are homeless because they do not have a safe place to live. And so category 4 captures that intersection between gender-based violence and housing instability that allows them to be eligible for those programs, which we'll talk about when we get to our HUD slides, that use this McKinney-Vento homelessness definition. So number 1, prior to VAWA 2022, this is already in effect, but this category 4 used to be very focused on domestic violence, and it has since expanded to make sure that we're capturing all the different types of violence and abuse that an individual may experience, and that they're still qualifying for our programs. And then if you can go to the next slide. Our future 2022, which is in the process of being implemented, will also expand past that. And there is some guidance online about what to do in the interim with this homeless list definition for our programs. So that's on HUD.gov/file. You can review that. But this expands it out to, it says the word, experiencing trauma or lack of safety. So even if someone is maybe not attempting to flee or leave, just the act of being in an unsafe unit. And then it also talks about, if the safety of themselves or their children are jeopardized, and then also expands out if they have no other, and used to say resident, it will now say safe residence. And again, all of these things, when we talk about safety, when we talk about trauma, it's all defined by the survivor. If they feel that they have a safe residence or if they have a lack of safety. So we're very excited about this update to this definition. Next slide, please.
Okay. Okay. Were you going to say something, Allison?
No, please.
Okay. No. Okay. So we're going to switch gears just a little bit to talk about HUD, and just to give you a little bit of insight, because I know it can be very confusing. So HUD is divided into 10 different regions. And so you'll see all of those regions here. It's going to cover all of the states and the territories. We provided some links so you'll be able to look all of those regions up, and you'll be able to find resources. Within all of these regions, they have the different states, right? And so we also provided a link for the states, and all of those states have their individualized page, which provides local resources, who to contact, who is the field policy and management officer in that region, who you can connect with. And so we wanted to provide that to you. I know there's way more to this, but we just wanted to give you that insight.
And I think this is very important because I know oftentimes, like, we will provide our contact information. You are free to contact our office. But often when you are interacting locally with the survivor, when they're coming directly to you and saying, I'm experiencing this, or I'm facing these concerns, it's really going to be the field office in HUD that is going to know that housing provider. They may have a local staff person assigned to them. Also, we have what we called, our front office. Each state has, a person that is the director of that, and they know also a lot of those resources. So if a state does have an emergency assistance, if they do have state-specific hotlines for additional resources, those are going to be the people, even more than reaching out directly to like HUD headquarters, that are going to have the best resources for survivors. So we share all this because I always think it's a helpful place to start, is to reach out to your local field office, or have a survivor reach out to their local field office when they're asking for assistance, or when they are trying to navigate HUD, because those people are going to know who locally is the right contact. And then our HUD.gov/states may have some additional resources there as well. So, Chicago has, I'm from Chicago, we have some emergency assistance. That's all on our HUD.gov/states Illinois specific site. Next slide. Okay, so you're reaching out to HUD, you're reaching out to the field office, so you're working with someone, and you're like, who do I talk to? What is the program? Because there are many, many, many different types of affordable housing. There's many different programs under HUD. So we are going to go through them very quickly. I promise to leave time for question, we'll see what happens. But I just want to highlight this, and we've kind of listed some of the programs that fall under each program office, as well as the ones that are covered housing programs, so you can start to navigate who to talk to. And we also know, right, that when a survivor is connecting with their housing authority or connecting with anyone about their housing, it's often unclear what exactly their assistance is at times, right? They may say, I have Section 8. Well, Section 8, even on this slide, is cross-cutting. You could be Section 8 with PIH, or you could be Section 8 with multifamily. It could also be that certain housing providers or programs or properties, right? And one property space, they have multiple different types of housing interact differently and have different requirements and all of these things. So I'm going to talk a little bit about them very briefly. So we have our Office of Public and Indian Housing, and the big ones under this umbrella are going to be our public housing programs and then our voucher programs. So there's about 1.2 million households living in public housing units, and there's around like 3,000 public housing authorities. So if you're thinking about if someone says they work with a housing authority, it is often, not always, but often with PIH. And so that's kind of the local program office that survivor is going to want to connect with. Same thing, you know, if an individual has a voucher, there are some responsibilities that their landlord has, but often the responsibilities also fall under whoever is, you know, has that voucher. So often a housing authority. And so this is the office that, you know, coordinates those vouchers and works with the housing authorities in different states and across the nation. The Office of Multi has what's called project-based rental assistance. They also have a number of specific types of rental assistance. So 202s is specifically for elderly individuals, and then 811s are specifically with individuals who may have a disability. And so this is often you're going to find multifamily is a specific property. There's like one owner, there's maybe one agent. And so they have a contract with HUD at that specific property. And they may not have other properties the way a public housing authority might. We have about 1.8 million households that are on project-based rental assistance, so it's still a huge program, and a number of those are also in our Section 202 and 811 properties. One thing to note about both public housing agencies and subsidized providers is they can create like local preferences for survivors. So we often hear that wait lists are a huge barrier to access housing. They can create local preferences for survivors who are transferring or who are just applying to housing. And so as you work with local housing providers, that's always something to highlight for them. Next slide. I'm going to pause here. Brittany, we have about 2 more slides. Should I keep going? Do you want me to pause?
I think we can keep going.
Okay, thank you. So the other kind of side of things that we have is our Office of Community Planning and Development, and they have so many things under them. And often the way that this funding happens is they actually provide grants out to states or participating jurisdictions or to COCs. So you may have a COC in your state that you work with. Those can be formula grants, those can be competitive grants, and there's a number of different ways in which that funding is then available to communities. So that could be through the block grant program, it could be through home and the housing trust fund. Often people are more familiar with the emergency solutions grant or COCs who have permanent housing, transitional housing, and they at times also have a DV bonus. So they work with victim service providers in that program. Under CPD is also the Housing Opportunities for Persons with AIDS, so HOPWA, which works with that specific population. Next slide, please.
Okay, so we kind of touched on the Office of Field Policy and Management earlier. They are the office that is going to communicate all the priorities and policies of the secretary. Like Allison said earlier, they are really embedded in the community. So they're going to be the first place that you're going to contact if you're wanting to contact HUD in your local area. And you can use that link that I was talking about earlier. The Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity, they're the office that's implementing and enforcing the laws and the oversight for all of these HUD covered housing programs that we talked about. They're also the ones that receive the discrimination and file the complaint that survivors can file these complaints through. We put the link there. It's also on our website. And then finally, there's also the Office of Housing Counseling, where I come from. I just want to put up a little plug, but when I was working direct services, I had no idea who the Office of Housing Counseling was. And Office of Housing Counseling really touches all of these offices too, as well. And we have over 1,500 housing counseling agencies nationwide. And they really work with consumers from anywhere from home ownership to homelessness to rental services, and they are connected and embedded in the community as well. So we put a link there so you can find a local housing counseling agency in your area. This is a really good connection with HUD, so you can work, victim service providers can work alongside housing counseling agencies. And that was a really quick version of that, so we can get to questions. I don't know if we have time for questions though.
And I'm so sorry. Can you go back 2 slides for me just really quickly? I forgot one key thing. Just thank you so much for the other offices of it. Just wanted to also highlight that I forgot to mention many of these programs under CPD. So our ESG, our COCs, those are where that homeless list category 4 definition applies. So I said I was going to highlight what those programs were. Those are these programs under CPD. So just that is an eligibility criteria for some of these programs that survivors could take advantage of. Anyway, go back to questions. just forgot that small point. I know we're over time, but happy if there's, I saw 2 questions in the chat, so I'm happy to answer those quickly. And then if you can actually, while I'm answering these questions, just go to the next slide for me as well. Just want to highlight, we have a bunch of resources available. So we have HUD Exchange if you're looking for program specific guidance, if you want to understand, housing authority, having public housing versus having a voucher. There's a lot of information on HUD Exchange and HUD.gov. Also, our HUD.gov/VAWA clearinghouse, please use those resources. That's where we'll continue to put information. And then our office inbox is attached here. So it's ogbv@hud.gov. So if you have questions or things like that, or if a housing provider wants to reach out as well, happy to meet and support survivors accessing their housing rights and all of that as much as we can. So please use that resource. Yvette and I monitor that, so you'll be hearing from us. And then I said 2 questions I can answer quickly. So one was in regards to survivors only having to say I qualify for protections and not having to specify. Does that include survivors who would like to utilize the emergency transfer plan under VAWA? Yes. So there are very clear requirements under VAWA as to what a housing provider can ask for. And so it's these different types of documentation, a self-certification form. They can get third-party documentation. So that's where it's a police report or an order of protection or something like that. They can also get a letter from a mental health individual. There's a list on our HUD.gov/VAWA if you want to see the full suite of options, and it's up to the survivor. That's both true when they're requesting any protections, including an emergency transfer plan or emergency transfer. An emergency transfer policy with the housing provider may also have other options. So it could be that they take just a verbal statement. It could be that I have also seen people accept other things where they've provided text messages or things like that. And that was what the survivor was comfortable providing. And the housing provider kind of took that and documented that. So yes. The second question there, I hear what you're saying. So it's a question when I'm working directly in housing, most voucher landlords have not heard of VAWA. Is there a way to make it easier, make an easy 1-pager for landlords to understand? I definitely absolutely hear you. So there's a lot of compliance requirements across housing providers that are very complicated, and VAWA is just one of them. And so we often see that people have questions or are not as familiar with the protections. So I definitely agree. That's even more true for landlords who are accepting vouchers, right? Because they're even like one step further from our housing programs. We are working on many, many resources, particularly with our training and technical funds in our office, and we have heard that time and time again. So please keep a lookout on HUD.gov/VAWA. We hear you. We want to provide additional fact sheets, one pagers, things that are accessible, things that are easy to use that really explain the protections under VAWA. So I'm not sure it'll be what to give to my landlord, but I absolutely hear you on that. That's what I have here. I don't know if there are any final questions or anything else you need from us, but we really, really appreciate being able to speak with you all. And we really appreciate all the work that you're doing with survivors. We see it, we hear it, and hopefully this was helpful to make sure that they can access and know their rights under VAWA within these housing programs.